So our next presentation is on the subject matter of chronic nuisance. To committee members, item number 3 and 4 are connected, so I hope we can deal with those. If Attorney Mark Manning, he's come forward, and any of the captains, Captain Gerard, Captain Harold, come forward, and we'll hear from the property manager, Robert Griffin. First, let me welcome you. Item number 3, I think, is long coming. Attorney Manning does a lot of work. We've talked about trying to provide some more support, so I'm honored to have that on the agenda and have so much bipartisan support from my colleagues on the matter. Attorney Manning, you have the floor.
Thank you to the chair. Good morning to the chair and to the committee. Once again, my name is Mark Manning with the Law Department, and I run the chronic nuisance program for the city. The chair asked the Law Department to report today on 6 properties, 3 that are located on West McMicken Avenue, and 3 more which are located, 1 in Avondale and 2 in the Fairmount English Woods area. Those last 3 are owned by the same owner. The first 3 on West McMicken are 2435 West McMicken, 2437 West McMicken, and 2515 West McMicken. To sum up just shortly, there's not a whole lot going on with regard to these properties from an enforcement perspective. 2435 West McMicken is a 2-family. They are on the chronic nuisance list. They were just sent an initial notice at the end of November. They've had 35 calls for service to that location this year, but most of those have been cleared by the officers as gone on arrival, meaning that they didn't encounter anyone when they actually went on the run, fitting the description or the purpose of that run. 2437 West McMicken is a 2-family. It is not on the chronic nuisance list, so it is below.
Attorney Manning, first, let me thank my colleague, Councilmember Simpson's office, for placing these on the agenda. But when you hear, and my colleague, Councilmember Flynn, said 35 runs to a 2-family, right? Is that what you said? So I just want to be clear that is a lot of activity to one location with a 2-family. And then to get there and not find anything happening, still we have deployment of our officers to a location, which is absolutely a problem. So.
Right, and I think the problem that the police and the law department encounter in that situation, and even the property owner encounter, is an absence of information to do something remedial about at that point. Certainly the community or perhaps the tenants are calling, or even the property owner might be calling, and obviously we want to get somebody there to gather information so we can do something about whatever is causing the problem. It becomes a significantly larger challenge when there's nobody actually there when the officers arrive.
Mr. Chair. We'll let I wanted to give some clarity around these addresses since I was the one that put them on. These are properties that have been identified by the community as areas that have been contributing to the trafficking issue that we have in the West McMicken community. I'm being careful because I'm a lawyer. I don't want to accuse anybody of anything, but the community has identified these properties over and over and over again as properties that are contributing to the activity that's been happening around trafficking in McMicken. And glad to hear that the one is being a part of chronic nuisance and being investigated. Want to hear about the others, but that's one of the reasons why we put it on here, because as you know, trafficking in that area is very concentrated. Poor property management contributes to activities that happen in and around properties if they're not properly managed, if they're vacant. We've heard of individuals living in properties, defecating in properties, sexual activity in properties, people being detained in properties. And so we just wanted to make sure we brought it to the attention of the committee to continue to be investigated.
Mr.
Vice Chair.
Yeah, just for clarity purposes for the community that's watching, we use the term chronic nuisance, and as those of us that have become acclimated to City Hall a little bit, it's kind of a term of art. It really is not what you think of as your traditional nuisance property with necessarily high weeds or falling down gutters. that's nuisance properties, and Mr. Manning also has to deal with those. These ordinances were passed in the past that created this group of properties that have excessive calls for service from the police department. So typically that means there's a lot of criminal activity going on. A number of these properties that are on this list have transferred, and not just transferred in the sense of one LLC to the different LLC that's the same owner. They're just playing the shell game with the city. These were truly transfers from someone that had been operating it perhaps poorly to a new owner. But the problem is the chronic nuisance calls haven't come down. The calls for service, the devotion of scarce police resources are being continued to be required as going to these areas. We get a report at City Council every month on the properties that are on the chronic nuisance list, but we've had a lot of trouble remediating those properties. Some of those properties continue on the list month after month, and one of the things that I for one want to see is, to a certain extent, we don't want to stop people. We don't want to disincentivize property owners from calling the police when there's a problem. But at the same time, we need to, we've been talking a lot about collaboration and partnerships. We need to truly have a partnership with the property owner. I truly believe that most property owners don't want criminal activity going on their properties. How we get to that solution of avoiding the constant calls to a particular address is something that I know Attorney Manning has been working on, and just to the apartment community owners as a group, we want to work with you. We want to help solve this problem. We're not, this is not a moneymaker for the city. This is a quality of life issue for the city. And the best thing that could happen, and I know Mr. Manning does this, reaches out and tries to avoid putting properties on the chronic nuisance list if we can get a solution before that. So I just wanted to make it clear to everyone, we're talking about numbers and numbers and numbers of calls to a particular address where the police are literally responding on this particular two-family 35 times on the last report, and never the ability to follow up because there's no one there when you get there.
Yeah, I agree with the Councilman Flynn, just that to the extent that I think the law department, the police department strive to cooperate as much as possible with property owners, but I think we recognize that a beneficial property owner, a cooperative one, is much more beneficial than an advantageous, some sort of relationship that's more confrontational at that point. So we do strive to do that for the most part. But once again, regardless of whether you're talking about chronic nuisance properties, public nuisance properties, because of the weeds, high grass, you still need evidence in order to obtain some sort of beneficial result for the community, which is the frustration with these with the gone on arrival issue for these properties. The other two that are on West McMicken, the second one is a two-family, which is directly next door, and that one is not on chronic nuisance enforcement, which means that for a property that size, I just had fewer than 6 calls for service over the last year. That 35 number was over once for the first property was over the course of the previous 12 months. So the second property, which is right next door, has fewer than 6 calls for service to that property. And finally, 2515 West McMicken is an apartment building, has 18 units owned by Downtown Property Management, and it has had 12 calls over the last year that qualify, which is 2 below their threshold. So they need approximately 14 in order to receive an initial notice.
Mr. Chair, you mentioned Downtown Property Management, and it's my understanding that the 2 other properties that are on this list, the Westwood Northern property and the Reading Road property, were owned by that same...
The last 3 on the list were owned by Downtown Property Management previously.
They've since transferred, but just in the last year.
A year and a half.
Year and a half.
Somewhere in that vicinity, yes.
So of really the only 3 apartment complexes that we have on this property, or on this report, all were the same owner.
Yes. The last 3, 3652 Reading Road, 1990 Westwood Northern, and 2000 Westwood Northern are all currently owned by the same owner, and were part of a large packaged transfer, a portfolio of subsidized housing that was transferred within the last 18 months. So they are relatively new owners to those properties. I know 3652 has been a subject of the committee's concern, I think the last several meetings, 2 or 3 at this point. And there has been some beneficial result. District 4 has tried to work, I think, with the property owner on some of those issues, and they've reduced the calls for service there. They were averaging, I think, somewhere in the 40s, and they are down to, I think, they had about 15 calls for service last month. However, they had about 78 total CAD events, so the computer-aided dispatch system recorded 78 events, but most of those were proactive by police officers making directed patrols for trespassers and other issues in the property to try to discourage some of the people that don't live there that are causing the problem from even being there to begin with. And I think for the first time in months, if not years, this property has dropped off the repeat address list for each district, which is reported every month. So that is a good reduction for that particular property. The other 2 have basically been stagnant in terms of their reduction or where they're at. I will say that in terms of crime, at 1990 Westwood Northern, there were 5 offenses which were reported, and 4 which were reported in the last period at 2000 Westwood Northern. The actual reported crime at both of those locations since the new owner took over is down. They're down from, I think both properties actually averaged about 4 offenses per month last year, and this year they're averaging somewhere around 2.5, both of them. So that is beneficial. However, the calls for service are basically the same, I would say, for the most part. In terms of nuisance calls for service, which are the types of calls which can range from drugs and disorder to noise complaints, 1990 Westwood Northern had about 9 last month. The total number of calls is 24, and they average about 20 over the last several years. So they're about in the middle of that average. For 2000 Westwood Northern, there's actually quite a few calls for service, nuisance calls for service last month. There were 34 nuisance calls. However, 26 of those were related to noise complaints for 2 tenants in particular. So obviously, those are still a problem, and I think District 3 is working on those in particular. But excluding those, they're about the same. So they're about 8 or 9, just like 1990 is. But they are actually increasing the last several years in terms of calls for service.
And again, just so that people understand, the issue becomes one, when you identify a tenant that is causing trouble, there's a legal process that has to be followed by the owner to remove that tenant, and it's not always a simple, easy process. Certainly, if someone is dealing drugs out of a property, it's a relatively easy process. 3 days, within a couple weeks, you're in front of the court, and you'll usually get that immediate writ. If it's a noise complaint, it becomes a 30-day notice process, then a 3-day notice process, and then perhaps an answer, counterclaim, claim of retaliation, and these things can drag on for months. All the time, that tenant remains in the property, so it becomes a process of, once you finally do remove that tenant, of tenant screening up front so that you don't put a new tenant in there and then have to start that whole process again. One of the things that Mr. Manning and I have spoken about, and I think has been relatively receptive, especially where there is subsidized housing or vouchers being received, is having the Metropolitan Housing Authority be involved in the process, because they have certain authority that we don't have. They can expedite the process somewhat, and so there's again, it seems to be a theme today, Mr. Chair, of working collaboratively with other governmental agencies. I just want people to understand, especially when there's been a change of ownership, you inherit a lot of tenants. And sometimes it takes longer than any of us would like to get a changeover in that tenant base. And until you get that changeover, it's hard to attract the tenants that you want to have in your buildings. That being said, I don't want to sound like an apologist for property owners that have, there are actions that cooperative property owners are taking in our city, including hiring off-duty police officers to be on the grounds and things like that. So,
because at the end of the day, these types of properties are draining resources from our police departments, and I believe makes our professional police department more unsafe, because they're doing all of these runs to these locations and unable to deal with the other issues that we want our officers doing. And I know the captains would agree with that. The other piece, I don't hear you, Vice Chair, making apologies for the property owners. The good news is that some of the numbers have dropped on the property 3652 with the new owners, and that's good news. We're still not where we want to be, and the problem is that the property owners around some of these properties have been living with this horror for so long, and it is absolutely tearing the equity out of their homes. And so we want to continue to highlight them. I know we've been meeting in the mayor's office, and we've been talking about a broader solution. I appreciate Councilmember Simpson's office giving us these addresses. They're going to stay on this agenda, and we're going to keep them on there. I want my colleagues to, if you have other addresses, we will continue to highlight them, because what you just heard was the runs went down. So we went from 40 or 45 or 50, I don't remember what the number was, to 15. Let's get it down even lower. And I think working and cooperating with the property owners, but also having these properties on our agenda, highlights to the new owners or the old owners that we are focused on these properties. And we're going to hold you accountable to screening your tenants and making sure that your premises are safe and that you're not disturbing the peace around those properties.
The reality is that over time, one property can create a condition in a community that creates vacancy, which contributes to more crime, because people don't want to live next door to a place that's unsafe. And then we have the situation like we had in West McMicken, where when I started talking to that community 3 years ago, people stopped calling because nothing happened. So you can't get calls for service if people give up. And so we started to help educate, and Officer Johnson, Lisa Johnson, and others who work diligently in that area said you have to keep calling. Because if you stop calling when you see things happen, then we won't know to continue to send resources. And so you get basically a fatigue in the community because they've given up. They really don't believe anything's ever going to happen. And again, then those individuals may abandon, sell, move away, and then this vacancy breeds more and more criminal activity. And so it's really important for us, particularly when you have several properties within the same block, or you have a theme of one property manager, many properties all over the city, to really be able to bring these things under control, because it breeds all kinds of challenges. I remember when I went to my first STARS meeting with the police department, and I saw the theme right away. They had the map up, and they said, we got hot spots over here, and hot spots over here, and hot spots over here, and they're all over the city, and they're managed by the same company. So one company could be, or two companies could be contributing to a huge amount of crime all over the city. And those type of patterns are things that I'm really sensitive to, and so I'm really glad that we have Mark Manning really helping us understand that better, because we may not be able to control 20,000 properties, but if you find out that there's one on a block that's tearing up the whole neighborhood, or one property manager that's influencing lots of crime across the city, we can start to deal with that.
You know, right now we're kind of playing catch up. The properties have already torn down some of these streets, some of these neighborhoods, and we're trying to catch up. But at the point we catch up, that's when we have to put the full court press on. And as soon as that first broken window, as soon as that first call for service goes in, hopefully we can be proactive and intervene in those properties to enhance our neighborhoods instead of allowing our neighborhoods to be torn down.
My point is that I want the property, that's right, I want the property scenario that we're talking about here, because I think all of us, and I don't want to speak for my colleagues, that we all feel very strongly about property rights, right? But we also feel very strongly that those property rights can't trample over other people's property rights living next door to them. And they can't, just sponge out resources from our police department. So in saying that, property owners should be on notice that we're focusing on this with a laser as we go into 2015. This is not going to stop. And I think that my colleagues are going to continue to place these properties on our agenda to look at them and make sure that the property owners know that we're not playing around. We want them to deal with these situations, and that they have not just plans on file with dust on them, that they're actively working to deal with the problem. And that's been the issue, meaning someone introduces some type of plan, but then they don't execute on the plan. And we're in this kind of circle, every month or every year. I'm hoping that with this new assistant or this new clerk coming to your office, and I'm going to claim it. I'm gonna act like I'm Reverend Wimburn. I'm gonna claim it that you're going to have some help in your office that you've been asking for, so you can expand your proactive work around these properties. And I just think that piece of it is so important.
And I think I speak on behalf of the interim solicitor, Terry Nestor, in saying that I think that's very much appreciated and needed in our department to the extent that we could do more with more resources. And I think kind of the responses to these three properties we have listed today kind of illustrates the short-term solution to those, which is I think we have, especially on the Reading Road address, tried to work cooperatively with the property owner. And so we spent a lot of city resources putting a lot of cops there that aren't being called there, but are going there just to make sure that people who aren't supposed to be there aren't there, discouraging those people, criminals, from being there. But that's not sustainable. That's a great short-term solution, but sooner or later, those properties have to change because the city can't continue to flood those properties with police officers. And while adding an assistant is certainly appreciated, and it helps our office do a lot more and be a lot more proactive, ultimately it's going to take police officers on the ground to solve a lot of these problems as well.
Let's take up item number 3. Let me read item number 3. So we move that the city administration provide a cost estimate and funding source to provide an additional legal assistant to the law department for the purpose of providing paralegal and clerical support for the chronic nuisance and civil nuisance enforcement functions performed by the solicitor's office. Are there any questions about item number 3? Roll call vote on item number 3.
Councilmember Flynn,
Yes.
Councilmember Simpson, Councilmember Smitherman,
Yes.
Councilmember Winburn.
And item number 4 is a report from our interim city solicitor, Terry Nestor, on chronic nuisance premises enforcement. Are there any questions about the report? Okay, so I'll just approve and file item number 4.